Welcome, everyone. It's great to see in the chat. We have people from Kenya, Nigeria, China, Colombia, Italy. Thank you so much for joining us for what we're calling a general debate warm-up meeting. Last Friday, when the Secretary General released this new report called Our Common Agenda, he said global governance may sound lofty or abstract, but it's not. It really is, it's the conversations, it's the negotiations, it's the efforts to move agendas forward, to identify shared objectives, shared agendas, and how those agendas are going to be implemented. And that's what's going to be happening at the general debate at the opening of the UN General Assembly. And so we've come together to give you some clues, to give you some tips on what you should be listening for, how to look at this opening of the General Assembly and what will be interesting. I'm really pleased that María Fernanda Espinosa Garces has been able to join us. She's an Ecuadorian scholar, diplomat, and politician, and has held many leadership positions for the government of Ecuador, serving as Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Defense, and Minister of Culture and Natural History. Furthermore, she was the first female ambassador and permanent representative of Ecuador to the United Nations offices in New York and in Geneva. Most recently, Ms. Espinosa served as the president of the 73rd session of the UN General Assembly, becoming the fourth woman in history and the first from Latin America and the Caribbean to preside over this body. She's currently a member of the Strategic Committee for Science panel for the Amazon of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, a member of the International Lancet COVID-19 Commission, a counselor for the World Future Council, a member of the Multi-Stakeholder Steering Committee of the Generational Equity Forum, member of the Political Advisory Panel for the Universal Health Coverage 2030 movement, fellow of the World Academy of Art and Science, member of the Group of Women Leaders for Change and Inclusion, and a fellow of the Bosch Academy. So welcome and thank you so much for joining us. We'll also be joined by Javier Surasky, who's a program officer of the Governance for Development area of CEPEI. He's a chair of the International Cooperation Development Department of the International Relations Institute of La Plata National University in Argentina. He's a senior researcher primarily oriented to development studies, particularly in global development agendas and the 2030 Agenda implementation and follow-up processes. And he's a member of the Together 2030 core group. He earned his PhD in international relations and an MSc in international cooperation and humanitarian action. Over the past 3 years, he's published more than 10 works related to the 2030 Agenda, implementation and follow-up processes, and the ongoing UN reform process and COVID-19 pandemic impacts on SDG achievement. Javier has been analyzing Latin America and the Caribbean positions in the UNGA general debate and the main UNGA outcomes since 2015. I'm Lynn Wagner. I'm the Senior Director of IISD's Tracking Progress Program. In this role, I oversee projects that seek to increase the accountability of decision-making for the Sustainable Development Goals, enhance engagement in the SDGs, and develop SDG indicator and reporting tools. I have a PhD in international relations and have been observing and analyzing multilateral environmental negotiations as a writer for IISD's Earth Negotiations Bulletin since 1994. So with that, with those introductions, I'm really pleased to turn it over to María Fernanda. Please.
Thank you, Lynn. It's such a pleasure to be with you today. greetings from Berlin. I'm delighted to see you, and I would like to, of course, start by thanking CEPEI and IISD for this opportunity to do a prospective exercise on what to expect during the high-level week on this 76th edition of the UN General Assembly. And I think that you started with the phrase from UN Secretary General saying that multilateralism is diffuse, is difficult to grasp. And I think that we have to start by saying, like, we are living, this is a time like no other, characterized by multiple and interconnected crises, spanning from the gravest global health emergency marked by the outburst of the fourth wave of COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic, a climate catastrophe with a reiteration of extreme weather events worldwide, like the floods in New York just a few days, 2 weeks ago, and staggering inequalities fueled by a major economic breakdown. So I think the UN High-Level Week will be, as we know, it will be matched by the US Global COVID-19 Summit on the 22nd of September and the Food System Summit on the 23rd. So my first hope and wishful thinking is that leaders will connect the dots. Climate, food, health, they are common goods and require a multilateral response. The multiple crises we are experiencing are a reflection, a symptom of a dysfunctional system. And what we need is, we need to repair the broken relationship between society, the economy, nature, and politics. And here I would like to perhaps go back to the etymology of the word politics, which is the art of governing a place, a city, the planet. So we are in need of good politics. And I am sure that citizens from around the globe will be watching, and more importantly, is seeking responses, guidance, a sense of hope and direction. And next week, when we are going to witness the 76th high-level week. So the last list of speakers, we were discussing this at the beginning, goes beyond 100 heads of state and government coming to New York that have inscribed to the general debate in person. So we need to see how many actually travel to New York in spite of the request by the US government to consider pre-recorded messages and virtual participation because of the Delta variant, basically. So we will see who comes to New York. It is true, again, that we are living extraordinary times. There is a need for extraordinary responses. And perhaps allow me in a few minutes to draw a quick map of what is happening in the world and why is that we need a strong, vital, retooled multilateral system. First, the climate crisis is, I would say that it's a tangible, grave threat to our survival as a species. Deaths, displacement, conflict, economic disruptions are the consequences if urgent action is not taken. The signs that we are approaching a point of no return in climate change and moving towards an ecological and civilizational catastrophe, I think, are unequivocal. Only last August, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change painted a bleak picture in its report. We were told loud and clear that we are dangerously close to breaching the Paris Agreement goal of limiting average global temperature rise in 1.5 degrees Celsius, above, of course, above pre-industrial levels. And this rate is unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years. So I think that if we maintain the increase in global temperature, this will require investment in low carbon transition, a serious low carbon transition that amount to $1.6 trillion and 3.8 trillion annually until 2050. And we know the world is falling behind its commitments to stabilize climate, but also to fund climate mitigation and adaptation. A recent study of UNEP looked at what the 50 leading economies are doing in terms of recovering from COVID and investments in COVID recovery. And basically what we see is that investment in true green economies, low carbon technologies, renewable energies do not reach even the 20%. I think it's 18% of the global recovery spending in 2020 could be considered green investment. So insufficient investment in climate mitigation, but also shortages in climate finance for adaptation and resilience in the global south. I think it is a crisis, but it also provides an ample space for leaders to commit and walk the talk in delivering on the Paris Agreement and beyond, because we already know that the goals in the Paris Agreement are insufficient. So that's one of the key messages that we would like to hear, and we hope to hear next week. Commitments for climate action, especially investment, the funding that is needed for climate adaptation and mitigation in the low-income countries that are, by the way, the ones that suffer the most of the climate impacts. Even though now it's even difficult to distinguish if we look at what is happening in the United States, for example. It's not only New York, but it is the hurting drought in the West Coast, for example. And the number two is the COVID pandemic. We would like to hear, sound, loud, committed voices for a global response to the COVID-19 pandemic. It has, unfortunately, our response as a global society is the lack of a well-orchestrated action. It's been close to 2 years since the pandemic was declared, and the multilateral system has not been able to shape a coherent, all-encompassing collective response. We know, the 220 million infections, the more than 4.5 million deaths, the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, and the first increase in global poverty in more than 20 years. So according to the World Bank, 97 million additional people fell into poverty in 2020 because of COVID-related shortages and difficulties. So unfortunately, and these are bad news, and that's what I hear from the experts at the Lancet Commission, is that the end of the pandemic is not likely to happen soon. And this, it is painful to acknowledge, but it is not due to lack of knowledge, of technical expertise, of technological capacities to control the pandemic. It is more related to the lack of multilateral action and global solidarity. In fact, I think that the unprecedented and historical development of the COVID-19 vaccine in less than a year was a result of the progress in science, the cooperation among scientists and scientific institutions worldwide. And however, when it came to the international rollout of vaccines, the multilateral system did not have a well-oiled mechanism for its equal access and distribution globally. Industrialized countries have favored vaccine nationalism, vaccine hoarding instead of cooperation, short-sighted strategies that have jeopardized even further the public trust in the multilateral system. So, and here, allow me to quote WHO Director General. He said that vaccine inequity is the world's biggest obstacle to ending the pandemic and recovering from COVID-19. And why? Because around 57% of the population have been vaccinated in industrialized countries with at least one dose, while in low-income, middle and low-income countries, only 2% of the population has at least received one dose. 2% versus 57%, this is really not good news. And we all know, and we have to acknowledge that the failure of COVAX, this multi-stakeholder mechanism to ensure access to vaccines for developing countries, I think that COVAX is perhaps the best example of how much we need a well-functioning multilateral system, a global immunization plan that we do not have after 2 years of the pandemic. And the numbers are out there. We need $50 billion investment in vaccine production and rollout to reach at least 70% of the global population vaccinated by July 2022. So that's another message we are really looking forward to hear next week. Where are the resources going to come from? The commitments. It's not about voluntaristic, giving away the excess of vaccines that some countries have. It is a multilateral global plan to ensure that vaccination does happen in a fair and equal manner, in access to vaccines as well. So if it does not happen, if we do not hear concrete commitments next week, and also looking forward to the US summit on COVID-19 on the 22nd, recovery is going to be uneven. Industrialized countries are growing at a pace between 6 and 8%. And low-income countries at less than 3%. And this trend is for sure will increase disparities within and among countries and cause, of course, more polarization, more anxiety, more sense of insecurity, greater mistrust in institutions. And the question here is how to restore trust in our political systems, including the multilateral system. And we're going to hear that next week. I really hope that leaders, the more than 100 that have inscribed for the general debate next week, are going to really reflect or say boldly what the world and public opinion is expecting worldwide. Giving the very bleak picture that I painted at the beginning, I think that this general debate, this 76th general debate, cannot be a one more session, but a critical moment in world history. And I'm not exaggerating. And here I agree with the UN Secretary General when he speaks in his Our Common Agenda report about two possible paths: a breakout or a breakthrough. And since using the words of late Kofi Annan, I am a stubborn optimist, I prefer to think about a breakthrough of world leaders coming together in New York, physically or virtually, with strong and bold messages, with an inspiring narrative of hope. We need to mend the broken trust in institutions, in the multilateral system. The world, public opinion, will be waiting for responses, for commitments, for strong and bold messages, and looking for what I call a narrative of hope. I think that consciously or unconsciously, every person is coming to realize that we are going through a civilizational crisis that requires not only world leaders, but requires us all to be better equipped conceptually, politically, institutionally to respond to the current crisis of civilization. And this moment truly presents a unique opportunity for a civilizational change. I don't even know if the word exists in English, sorry about that, but that's what we need. And we expect, of course, heads of state and government to react to the Secretary General's report on our common agenda. It was just launched only last Friday. And I would say, without a doubt, and I've been an actor in multilateral affairs for more than 20 years, I think that without a doubt, this report stands out. The Secretary General prepares about 400 reports to the General Assembly every year. But this report aims at providing a blueprint on how to strengthen the United Nations under the principles of inclusion, of intergenerational justice, for a greener, a safer, a more equal future. In this sense, the report is set, I would say, to trigger a new foundational moment for the multilateral system. And we really hope that that's exactly what we're going to hear from world leaders next week. I think that given the significance of the report on our common agenda, it should trigger the interest, the engagement of states in the implementation that will require an intergovernmental process. But not any intergovernmental process, but one that is transparent, inclusive, where societies, citizens, sectors could have a substantive voice and participation. And basically, I would summarize our common agenda in three main blocks. One is the renewal of the social contract, and this to be anchored in human rights and building trust, social cohesion from an intergenerational, intersectoral approach. Number two is to look at the future through a deepening of solidarity and highlighting the transformative role of young people and future generations. So this intergenerational approach of this report, I think it's worth noticing, but also acting upon. It is suggesting the establishment of a strong institutional architecture to give voice and agency to the younger generations. And the number three, the need to establish an institutional architecture to deliver on our global commons. Global commons meaning the atmosphere, outer space, Antarctica, the high seas, but also the global public goods, such as global health, but also peace and security, but also our economic rights as public goods. So basically, I think that these are the three areas of our common agenda that deserve, and we would expect the leaders of the world to pick up, but also to commit themselves to continue the process. Again, the worst that can happen to a report of this depth and scope is to just take note and let's continue business as usual. So this cannot happen. I think that our Common Agenda report proposes a summit for the future. And this summit for the future should be the catalyst, the enabler to seal this new social contract. And that, of course, requires co-building, active citizenry. So during last year, there has been a recurrent call by the United Nations, by actors, societies, academia, about the need to seal this new social pact. And I think that the opportunity to building forward better, a greener, a more equal future in the wake of the pandemic requires for sure a new ideational and institutional setup that can decouple the vicious cycle of growing inequalities, insecurity, mistrust in politics and institutions. So I'm really hopeful that next week we will hear inspiring speeches and bold action-oriented commitments to overcoming the COVID pandemic, but fostering a greener economic recovery and pushing for stronger commitments for COP26. And of course, the implementation of the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals and beyond. So we are very much looking forward to hear world leaders commit to stronger and decisive action against the climate crisis, setting the tone for stronger outcomes to key events in the coming months. The G20 meeting in Italy in October, the COP26 in Glasgow in November, the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the UN Ocean Conference in 2022 in Lisbon. So there is a lot to look forward to. In conclusion, let me just close. I think I took too much time perhaps, but in conclusion, leaders and us all as citizens, I think we all have a unique opportunity to renew our vows to the founding principles of the UN Charter, especially to the opening phrase of "We the peoples" of the United Nations. I think that I've been, very closely following and committed to the revitalization of the UN, and that must bring the multilateral system closer to the peoples it serves. And that means democratizing its decision-making spaces to govern our commons. It is a matter of shared responsibilities, of accountability. As our common agenda report states, we have, and I want to go back to the beginning, we have two choices. One of breakdown and perpetual crisis, and one of breakthrough, peace and sustainable development. And I am convinced that next week, world leaders will choose the breakthrough option. So we have to say that sometimes, and I have to say that some leaders, when they come to New York, they often privilege their domestic audience when they speak. No, today, I think that the world we are in need to listen to visionary leaders, to truly speak to the world's parliament, to the G193 on how to ensure that global leadership and concerted action based on generosity, on cooperation, on solidarity is privileged over go-it-alone responses, which we have learned the hard way, which are simply not an option in current times. So I think that the future starts today, very much looking forward to next week. And basically, we hear over and over again, we want deeds, not words, even though I am convinced in the incredible power of words. So we have to pay attention to the words and make sure that the words transform into a better reality for people in need worldwide. So thank you very much again for this opportunity, and back to you, Lynn. And sorry, I think it took me perhaps too long, but back to you, Lynn and Javier.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And thank you for that context setting for where we are, what the challenges are, what we are hoping to hear our leaders say. So with that, Javier and I will be talking a bit about the kind of the mechanics and the organization of the next 2 weeks to help you think through what we're listening for when different heads of state will be speaking. There's I guess so the next few weeks will be organized as kind of the general debate, where all heads of state will be coming to make statements. There'll also be a series of high-level events during the next 2 weeks on specific topics that help the leaders to drill down. There's been a whole year or so of preparations on those topics that will be backing up and setting the agenda for what we'll be hearing there. And then there'll be other events like María Fernanda mentioned, the US Summit on COVID-19. There'll be a number of other events. And so if you're watching the news, you'll just hear, so-and-so leader of country said this. But so, try to see which event this statement took place, and that'll help you hone in on which agendas are being discussed. So just starting with the general debate. This is a really important point for heads of state to be heard. All heads of state have the opportunity to speak. The other countries are listening to what they have to say. I guess a great example is the really kind of iconic example of Premier from Soviet Union banging his shoe on his desk. That was in response to hearing something that a member from the Philippines had said. He was responding to what was being said. Many of the statements will sound like laundry lists that you might expect the country to say, but they're calibrated, they're very intentional. Sometimes they're provocative, sometimes they're surprises. During his first few years in his presidency, the US president, then US President Trump, used his opportunity to denounce multilateralism that, as María Fernanda said, was probably mainly for a domestic audience, but there were some messages for the international community as well. So people are going to be really listening to US President Biden to see what he's saying about how the US intends to help restore this trust that that's so necessary for the global community to move forward. There'll be some surprises. Last year, China's premier announced its ambition to reach carbon neutrality before 2060 and to ensure its greenhouse gas emissions would peak in the next decade. During the general debate speech, that announcement was not really expected to take place at that point. So keep your ears open because there are surprises, there are interesting messages during these statements during the general debate. Obviously, I guess we're hoping, and the big challenge, global challenge that is keeping us back is the vaccinations. What are countries going to be saying about global, how we're going to get the global community vaccinated? Because as long as COVID-19 variants emerge, we aren't all going to move forward. And the inequity gap in vaccinations has to be addressed if we're going to address that. Climate change and biodiversity will be addressed in a variety of contexts. As María Fernanda mentioned, the recently approved IPCC report providing new estimates of the chances of crossing the global warming level of 1.5 degrees Celsius in the next few decades has really increased the pressure for meaningful action. Will meaningful action be discussed here? And how are countries setting up to move towards the November COP26 in Scotland. And for that, countries were supposed to submit enhanced action plans and targets as part of the Paris Agreement. Will they be discussing those? Climate finance and adaptation will also figure into the comments. Last year, there was a biodiversity summit as part of the opening of the UN General Assembly. And during that biodiversity summit, the links between climate change and biodiversity were really highlighted. So those interconnections, expect to hear those discussed, and especially now calls for addressing nature-based solutions. Expect to hear those quite a bit. And in anticipation of the Convention on Biological Diversity's COP15, and the decision to be taken there on the global biodiversity framework through to 2050. There'll be some messaging around that. As I mentioned, there are a number of high-level events that are going to be taking place in the next 2 weeks. And these, are targeted events with specific agendas. At the beginning of this 76th session of the UNGA, we'll have the SDG Moment, the Food System Summit, high-level dialogue on energy, a high-level event on jobs and social protection for poverty elimination, celebration of the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action by the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, and the high-level plenary meeting to commemorate and promote the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons. And so these events will bring action, and a number of them are hoping to bring kind of roadmaps and new commitments and identify new recommendations for how nations and the global community can move forward, and elevating these issues to the highest level, in some cases for the very first time, or for the very first time in many, many years. We'll start off with the second annual SDG Moment. That happens right before the general debate starts, which is kind of a nice way to set the scene. The SDG Moment will bring a presentation of the state of SDGs, which will provide a reality check of where we stand and where we need to go. Is likely to be that, where we stand and where we need to go is going to be a theme in many statements over the next 2 weeks. Leaders from over 30 countries will be participating in that SDG Moment. Themes for that event, many of them align with the themes in the Our Common Agenda report that just came out: gender equality, connectivity, youth in action, localizing the SDGs. That'll be followed by the Food System Summit, the first ever time that the UN at this highest level is discussing this topic. And that agenda will be, that day will be focused around 5 action tracks: ensuring access to safe and nutritious food for all, shift to sustainable consumption patterns, boosting nature positive production, advancing equitable livelihoods, building resilience to vulnerabilities, shocks, and stress. The day after that, the UN General Assembly at this highest level will discuss, meet for the high-level dialogue on energy. And this is the first time in about 40 years that the UN General Assembly will be discussing energy issues. The last time was the UN Conference on New and Renewable Sources of Energy in 1981. So this is a really important point where the attention of the heads of state is going to be on energy issues and what a global roadmap would look like for addressing these challenges, especially in relation to achieving SDG 7. And this meeting will also have 5 themes: energy access, energy transitions, enabling the SDGs through inclusive, just energy transitions, innovation, technology and data, and finance and investment. The following week, there'll be the high-level event on jobs and social protection for poverty elimination. And this is going to be convened virtually by the Secretary General and the Prime Ministers of Canada and Jamaica. And it comes out of a process that began in May 2020 to respond to COVID. It was the Financing for Development in the Era of COVID-19 and Beyond initiative. This meeting will also address 5 pressing issues: application of effective economic, social, and environmental policies at the country level, the global norms and standards underpinning the socioeconomic recovery and a just transition, current efforts to achieve just transitions in the context of ambitious climate action and the COVID recovery, opportunities and synergies created by integrating policies of climate action, technology, health, jobs, social protection, and poverty eradication. And then alleviation of key constraints and market failures that impede sustainable development finance. So where does this global discussion go next? As María Fernanda mentioned, there's going to be a G20 meeting in Italy right before the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change's COP opens. The Convention on Biological Diversity will have its meeting. There'll be a high-level segment online in October, and then the in-person event is scheduled for next spring. The next, I guess, is it summer now, mid 2020, the dates have now been announced for the UN Ocean Conference to take those issues forward. And in July of 2022, there'll be the annual high-level political forum on sustainable development, that annual check-in on SDG implementation. And so all of these events pick up these themes that, the just transition, the inequities, the need for engagement of youth, women, those, being sure that we are not leaving people behind, protecting our planet, promoting peace to preventing conflict, abiding by international law and ensuring justice, building trust, improving digital cooperation, upgrading the United Nations, ensuring sustainable financing, boosting partnerships, listening and working with youth, and being prepared for future crises. And those are the 12 commitments that the heads of state adopted at the last General Assembly in the declaration for the 75th, marking the 75th anniversary of the UN. And those are the 12 commitments that the UN Secretary General picked up in the report he released last Friday on our common agenda. And we expect countries to continue to be thinking about how they can move that forward and implement what they've identified as the shared challenges that they need to address. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Javier, who will continue to talk about some of the modalities and mechanisms for how this is all going to happen.
Thank you, Lynn. It's a pleasure to be here today discussing with María Fernanda, with Lynn, and with all the participants on our expectations on the phase of the 76th General Assembly. Let me first introduce me. I am part of the CEPEI team. CEPEI is an independent think tank established in 2002, headquartered in Bogota, in Colombia. And CEPEI works based on data and analysis to empower people and institutions to find pathways towards sustainable development. We work globally and specialize in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we were following and analyzing the general debate statement for many years. But focusing on this year's general debate, even when the attacks on multilateralism and the UN led by Trump administrations will not be present, which does not mean that the friendly fire has ceased, the UN meeting did not start, and it's already facing some roadblocks. The first is linked to the pandemic restrictions. As you may know, the US mission to the United Nations has sent a letter to the other 192 UN missions, calling them to send a pre-recorded message to avoid the risk of the general debate becoming a super spreader event, as they call it. And more recently, Mark Levine, a member of the New York City Council, tweeted, and I quote, "The UN is not requiring vaccination for participants. This will expose them and New York City to serious risk. The UN needs to announce now that vaccination will be mandatory." I remind you that the UN is making vaccination mandatory for its own staff members, but not for foreign diplomats. In this situation, many countries will likely wait until the last minute to make a decision on traveling to New York or not. The last official available information taken from a second provisional list of speakers issued by the UN on September 10 tell us that near 110 countries will be represented by head of state and government in New York, and almost 60 will send a pre-recorded video, most of them developing countries. Some important things to consider: Joe Biden and Boris Johnson have confirmed their presence at the UN General Assembly Hall in New York, and the United Kingdom head of government is expected to present the progress made in the way to Glasgow COP20 conference. The UN has limited each country delegation at the General Assembly Hall to 4 persons, and one country said that it's trying to borrow seats in the hall of other countries who may not be sending a delegation, and neither the Secretariat nor the Office of the President of the General Assembly was able to say if swapping will be allowed. Second stone in the way this year is Myanmar's representation. Both the junta, with seized power on 1st February, and the National Unity Government made up of elected representatives whose parties won the Afghan national election last November, asked for the seat. The final decision is in the hands of the UN General Assembly Credentials Committee, although it's rare for the committee to accept the credential of an ousted government that does not hold power or control territory. It is not unprecedented. It happened in 1992 regarding Haiti, and in 1997 regarding Sierra Leone. Who will represent Afghanistan is also unclear. Afghanistan is listed in the last place in the provisional speakers list, but as far as we know, nobody asked to represent the country at this year's General Assembly. While the problems arising from the pandemic are still in place, the focus of discussions may subtly shift. We have moved slowly and not very effectively, I should say, from the initial shock produced by COVID-19 and the need to contain its impacts, to debates on the shortcomings of a fragile multilateralism, shifting from response actions to efforts to build forward better, even if we still feel far from the post-pandemic era, an expression that seems more discursive than real. The long, and I underline the word long, UN 76 General Assembly main theme reflects its change, and I quote, "Building resilience through hope to recover from COVID-19, rebuild sustainability, respond to the needs of the planet, respect the rights of people, and revitalize the United Nations." Poof, poof. Accordingly, we expect to hear world leaders' position on some today's world's critical issues. And I will underline just a few. Number 1, the 2030 Agenda as a guide for the most urgent task, namely build forward, not back, build forward better in an equitable manner, including equitable access to vaccines and COVID-19 treatments. Number 2, the future of the UN, including the recent proposals from the Secretary General, the ongoing reform process, and the current level of achievement of the UN Financial Compact. Number 3, concrete measures to fight climate change. And number 4, and last, action to strengthening multilateralism. In my perspective, 3 questions in particular will help us to analyze this year's general debate. The first one, do world leaders understood that we have arrived at the current pandemic situation because we did not heed science warnings? and that the same can be said about other global issues such as climate change? The second, is anyone considering the regional level as a leverage for change? The third, are countries thinking about the need for a stronger action-oriented and data-based work? Of course, there are many other possible questions: gender issues, technology gaps, world economy challenges. The regression of indicators on poverty and hunger are part of a seemingly never-ending list. I will finish inviting you to visit CEPEI Transparency Tracker, a web-based interactive virtual tool to find SDG-related information taken from the Latin America and the Caribbean statements at the general debate and compare it across states and time. And let me finish my participation so we have enough time to go to the questions. Let me finish my participation with a very, very UN phrase. The lid is off. I thank you.
Thank you. So I guess I've been looking at the Q&A. I think there's a very active chat, but in the Q&A section, I think there's a really good question, and I'll throw it open to both you, Javier and María Fernanda. The recovery assumes that we were on the right track in 2019, but how do we focus on a breakthrough rather than a recovery? Do either of you?
Javier, you want to go ahead?
Well, I think that some clues were mentioned during our presentations. I think that the first thing that we need to take into account is if the words are really speaking in an actionable way. I mean, I totally agree with María Fernanda. Words matters. Words are important. Words can show us the mindset the leaders are building to face the situation. But we need to create an actionable framework. So not only what they said, but the way they said things on the general debate, I think will be very important. If we really go through the situation, if we choose the breakthrough way, then what we need to find is actionable statements. I think that it will be the key.
Yeah, well, I agree with that, but the truth is, I think where the question came from is to say that even before COVID, we were completely off track in delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals. And I recall receiving the team that basically did an independent assessment on the SDGs in 2019. And they came to explain what were the big flaws, issues where we regressed, issues where we were doing better, and the issue of inequalities, the extinction crisis and biodiversity loss, and the climate mitigation commitments of the Paris Agreement weren't happening. We were really behind, keeping our word and doing what we needed to do, and that was already, a big shock. But in addition to that, with COVID, then regression, for example, we regressed in the decrease of extreme poverty. We were doing well in really phasing out extreme poverty in a process. But unfortunately, the numbers are going up again in extreme poverty and poverty for that matter, and with numbers we haven't seen in the last 20 years. So the truth is that we need a major retooling of our systems and institutions. It is not about a band-aid policy here. We are bleeding, but you know, it's not about just a band-aid. It is about understanding why is that we are bleeding, and there is a systemic transformation that we need to undergo, and that's why Javier said it, and I said it too. It's not about building back better, because the normality wasn't good enough, and it was leaving too many people behind, and it was really fracturing in a deeper way this disconnection between society, the economy, and nature.
Great, thanks. It looks like we're almost out of time. I've been looking through the question Q&A section, and I think one of the comments kind of helps us wrap this up. It says that there needs to be greater criticism and pressure put on world leaders and the minority who hold the power and the control. You know, we need to put pressure on all of our world leaders, and that's why we had this webinar to help us come together to talk about what we're expecting, how to watch the UNGA, so that we can tune into, you know, what our world leaders are saying, what we want them to be saying, and think about how to put that pressure on them to achieve the world that we want, and to, you know, to build back better. So with that, thank you so much. In answer to one of the questions, this webinar has been recorded, and so you'll be receiving the link. Thank you so much for joining us, and be sure to tune in 3 weeks. Tamara, can you get the next one? So we'll be having another webinar on October 5th to wrap up you know, what we heard based on this conversation about what we expect to hear, what we want to hear, what came out of it, and so then what are the next steps to be sure that we are putting pressure on all of our world leaders to achieve that world that we want. So with that, thank you so much to CEPEI, to Javier, to María, Fernanda, Espinosa. Thank you for joining us, and thank you all the participants. Have a good day.
Thank you.